Hey guys, can you see my screen?
Yes, Suman.
Okay. I think I still need to cover these things. I'll cover, let's see how much I can cover today. Okay. First, let's start off from where we left last time. So last time we faced an issue with use effect, where we had like several states, and once when we update one state, it was updating another state, and that kind of creates a kind of a race around condition in which our JSX was getting rendered in infinite number of times. So so yeah, so actually I took a wrong example for showing you how use effect works, because it became a little bit complicated. I should have, because the only reason I chose it is because I haven't covered the API calls, and then you'd be better understand the side effect. Okay, but so I'll give you two examples of use effect today. One will be the one that I'll complete the digital clock part, and the second would be like a more simpler example through which you can understand how the use effect actually works. Okay, so first things first, let's return some JSX first. Okay, and in here, uh, we will return our clock. Okay, now, for the state, we just create seconds. Okay, and use the use state hook. Okay, we initialize it with 0. Okay, now our like the basic is gonna be the same. Like we will use the set timeout, then we pass an anonymous function to this, and we increment it every 1,000 milliseconds. And so every 1,000 milliseconds, like the new second is gonna be incremented by second by 1, and we just use it to set second pass the new second here. Okay, so actually, a better use case for this is actually there's a JavaScript function called set interval. Okay, set interval works better in comparison to set timeout, but actually both of them works the same way only. Interval means like it will execute the anonymous function after a certain interval, and timeout means that it's gonna interview every time there's a timeout, like every after 1,000 milliseconds. So yeah, basically both works the same way, just the concept is different. So we use now, since this, as I explained last time, that set timeouts is a side effect. Side effect is because it's not a synchronous thing, like it executes after 1,000 seconds. So we wrap this side effect inside the use effect hook. Okay. And excuse me. Right. And so there's also one dependency array that we need to pass. I'll tell you what it is. Okay, now let's define a function called getTime. So last time the issue that was happening was like we defined too many states, and we had to, like, for every tick of a second, we had to update each and every state. That was the reason. So the one of the ways to solve it is to like think of it as, because the minutes depends on the seconds, and the seconds depends on hours. So one of the ways to solve with that would be to simply, you know, can like take the hours from the seconds and take the minutes from the seconds. Okay, so first let's you have the seconds here, so let's define hour. Okay, first, as I said, never ever play around with the original state, so we create a copy of that. Then we set it the hours to floor. So that would be your temp. And since hour you can get by dividing by 3600 because 60 into 60. Uh, so, and temp essentially contains the seconds. So if you divide it by 3600, you get the hours for that. The answer will be a floating point number. So we tweak the mat.floor of that. So that is like one. And if that is not the case, like if let's say that the temp by 3600 comes out to be, the floor of that comes out to be 0, then in that case, we need to return 00. If you remember the format, so that's how it was, right? So this is another new kind of thing that you will see, but you will see it very often in React. Like if this condition is true, then it will take this, otherwise it will take this. So that's why the or is there. Then now, yeah, before moving on to minutes, the first thing that we need to do is to divide this temp by 60, just to strip out the hours from this. And then we can define the minutes from there, like math.flow, whatever the temp is, modulo 60 will be your minutes. And if that is 0, then we define it 00. And the seconds is something that you already have. So since we are using this function to render in our JSX, that's why we return it from here. Now, see this, this might be a new thing for you. Sorry, minute. Yeah, so this is the way I'm writing it. In JavaScript, this is called string interpolation. So if you want to refer to a variable, like one thing is you can also create this string like this also, like let result equals to, you know, like you can put the hour here, then plus this, then plus something like that. You can also create it like this, but if this is the use case, then I think that a string interpolation, using string interpolation is much better. So because in string interpolation, you will be able to like clearly using the dollar sign, you can directly access the variable, and then you can render it. So at the time of this is like get time. So all we have to do now is to, in our JSX, we just need to call this function get time. Right, not like that. And that should give us our time. Yeah. Excuse me. So yeah, that's all. Let's start our app. Hmm. Seems like I missed something. No? Okay, nothing happened. Okay, I think we have forgot to, oh, I forgot to save it. Yeah. Hmm. Stop at, oh, okay, I got it. So yeah, in the dependency array, you have to pass this get time because that is something that we need to execute. Yeah. So this is like one way in which you can create your digital clock. Like one thing you should always remember when designing components is like you should avoid having, multiple states, because if there are like multiple states that you're using, then try to divide your component into further child components, just to, make sure that you don't update, multiple states within the same thing, because as I've already told you that updating a state will re-render the DOM. Okay, or in other words, it will like re-render this JSX part. Okay, not just this JSX part, this entire component will get rerun in a way. You can think of it like that. It will get rerun. So every time, let's say that you use a use effect and then you kind of update a state, then the entire thing gets run again. So again, your state gets updated. Yeah, so this is like the problem that starts to happen if you have like if you're using multiple states within a component and you are updating those multiple states multiple times. Okay, so that is one thing. uh, yeah, but as I said the last time that this is like a little bit tricky example of use effect. I want to give you a much more simpler example for this. So I will create another file here. Let that file be named use effect example. Okay, in this use effect example, I'll show you, uh, for example, calling an API. Okay, so calling an API is a side effect. You can think of it like this because, because you don't immediately get the results. There is a network latency involved. It may take 2 milliseconds. It may take 200 milliseconds. It may take 2 seconds. It may even take like 50 seconds or 100 seconds, whatever, depending on the timeout that is defined on the gateway. It can take like variable amount of time, and therefore you're not going to get the return from the API call directly. So that's the reason whenever you make an API call, that is what we call a side effect. Now, as I have seen, as you can see here, I have a separate session on, I'll take a separate session on API calls where I'll show you how to use actions and stuff. But for right now, I will just use an inbuilt JavaScript method called fetch, and I'll use that to essentially do a get request and get data, and just render that data. Just to give you an example of how it works. So let's import React. Okay, so first let me find out. So there's a very handy like API called JSON placeholder, which we use for testing. We go to JSON placeholder. It's a fake REST API, generally used for testing purposes. You can use it. So yeah, this is the API. So we will copy this into our code here. Right. So, mm, so one of the ways to actually run this API for the time being is like use the fetch method. This is an inbuilt JavaScript method. All you have to do is like simply pass the API. We generally don't we generally don't do that in real-time coding because you have certain issues like you need flexibility when you are working with real-time things. So we use Axios, and that is a different topic. Okay. Okay. Response. Yes. Okay. Yeah, another new thing that you might be looking at here, I'll tell you what it is. Let's also define a state here. Call it API call state. Yeah, state. Let it be like at the starting, let it be initiating. And if it is successful, then we set the set API call state. API call state to success. In here, we render API call state. Now, this entire, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you about chaining. So this fetch method, this actually returns a promise. Okay, so a promise is something in JavaScript which does not directly, like you won't get the answer right now, but you can be sure that you will get an answer at some point of time in the future. You know, for example, like in this API call, when the API call will happen, so at that point of time you may like right now, since the call just happened, you are not going to get the data, right? But it is promised that in the future, maybe after 2 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds, whatever, okay, you will get some response. Okay, that response can be anything. You can get the data, or at least, or you can get an error message, but at least you will get some response. So this fetch actually returns this promise. Okay, when you have this promise, then you can call the dot then method on it. On any promise, you can call a dot then method. So dot then method, what it takes an anonymous function, as you can see here. It takes an anonymous function, and what dot then method does is like once the promise is executed, then it will enter the then method and execute whatever you have defined in the anonymous function. So in here, what I've done is I have taken the response and converted the response to JSON, and then I have returned that. Okay, and then in the next step, I have again then called the then method, and whatever like the JSON response that I'm getting from here, um, I'm console logging it and I'm calling some state. One more thing that I need to do is like if there is a, you can, as you can see there are three methods on a promise that you can execute. One is then, one is catch, one is finally. So let's to go for catch, because if there is some kind of execution, then you also need to catch that, right? So just console log that error occurred and just print the error. So what happens is this API call happens. If you get a response, then it enters this then conditions. And I mean, it first enters this then condition. After it completes, then it enters this then condition. And if there's some error, then it enters the catch condition. And you can also call finally if you want. Yeah, for this purpose, we don't need any finally. Finally means if you want to, after the promise gets executed, if you want to clean up something or anything like that, then you can call the finally method. Okay, so that's all. I mean, now as I've already said that this is a side effect, right? So we have to wrap it inside a use effect hook. Remember one thing, don't get confused. You don't really have to wrap everything, every side effect in the use effect hook. Okay, that's because sometimes you have a function in which you are calling the async await or something like that. You can use the async await method, or you can use the promise method if you're not really concerned about what kind of side effect it creates. Okay, the only places when you have to use the use effect hook is like when you are concerned that something is going to cause trouble. Right, for example, if you are executing something and you want that once this executes, I want my state to get updated, and if you like do it without the use effect hook, then it may create problems because uh, let's say, for example, if I pass this empty dependency array here, what it does is like when your component gets loaded or re-rendered, it will just call your API this particular fetch call once. But if you ignore this use effect hook, then it may call it like 4, 5 times, 6 times, whatever. Every time the component gets re-rendered, it will keep calling that particular API. So if you are concerned that your side effect may cause issues, then in that case, you can use the use effect hook. Generally, it's a good rule of thumb that you should wrap your side effects in a use effect hook. But if you are like using some async await function, I'll show you about talk about async await function when we talk about APIs. Then in that case, it's not required to wrap it inside a use effect hook. Okay. So yeah, so that's all. So what it's gonna do is like we do the API call. Once the API call is success, in our React app, we will be able to see the success message because we are setting it here. Okay. And if we don't get it, like if there's some kind of error, then we will get an error on the console. And if it's success, we can see the data in our console log. Okay. That's it. Let's save it and let's come here. Okay. Let's see. Okay, there seems to be some issue here. Use state is not defined. Okay, got it. We have not imported the use state. We have imported use effect, but we have not imported use state. Now let's come here. Yeah, now you can see success. Now if you go to console, okay, let me clear this and reload the app. Yeah, so for that small time being, you saw that it said initiating, and then you saw the success message. So if you see here in the console, you will see that there's some object here. If you click on this object, okay, it seems like it does not have the data for this one, but you can see in the network tab, there was okay, wait, what happened? I didn't register in the network tab. Yeah, so in the network tab, you can see that there is an API call that happened to the JSON placeholder, this particular API that we used in our code here. So, and the status of that was 200. 200 means that the API call was successful, and it did not return any data. Perhaps they don't have any. Okay, we got it here. Yeah, that's the only data they have: title and ID and something, some field completed, which we are not sure because we don't know what the data is about. So, but yeah, the important thing is like it returned the data. We did a network call, and what we need to understand, we don't need to like get into depth about network calls right now. What we need to understand is the side effect thing, okay, and how we handle side effects in React. Yeah, so that's all about the use effect hook. I mean, you will learn a lot more about it as we go forward, but that's the basic understanding that you need to have for the use effect. Yeah, let me know if you guys have any questions up till this point.
No, Samantha, I'm good.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so that's all about use effect. Now let's come here. It says call. Yeah, use reducer. Okay. Okay, first, before doing use reducer, I need to make you understand about the introduction to the global state management that I can't do from this part. Let me
Somen,
see.
one doubt I have.
Yeah, look.
So you pass here empty array and the use effect as a second
Yeah,
argument.
yeah.
So and last one you pass some function, right? So what is the purpose of this one? Can you explain?
Yeah, so this is what we call the dependency array, and in the dependency array, you have to add anything that you are using in your inside this function. Not necessary. I mean, it's kind of optional, but if you don't use it, you will get a warning. What we want is like in this use effect, whatever dependencies that you have, that you need to pass, like in whatever dependencies you are using within this code, that is within this use effect, that is something that you have to pass in the dependency array. And when passing it in the dependency array, you should make sure, I mean, one thing that you should remember is like every time that value changes, your use effect will rerun. So for example, like if I take this API call state, and if I put it here, sorry, and if I like put it in the dependency array, then what it would mean is like every time we call this set API call, so this will set this API call state variable, and every time this variable gets set, your use effect will run. So obviously this code will lead to infinite loop, because from here you set the API, and then this is in there in the dependency array, it will change. So your use effect will re-render, I mean rerun, and then it will set again, and then it will rerun. So it will create an infinite loop, but that's what the purpose of this dependency array is. So in here, if you go to digital clock, here in the dependency array, yeah, so if you use the empty dependency array, what it means is that it will execute only once when your component renders. As I was talking about, like if you don't use this use effect hook and directly call the API, then it may get called multiple times. Okay, since we do not have any dependency in the dependency array, so you can be pretty sure that it will just get executed only once. Okay, but in here in the get time, so if I remove this get time, if you remember that we only got one there, because it got executed only one, this use effect hook, it got executed only one. So we have to give some dependency to it for it to check every time that it's running. So without giving the dependency in the dependency array, this use effect wouldn't run every time. So for this use case, we need to, and this is a very safe thing to give in the dependency array. This is a function, and a function is like something that's not going to change. It's not a variable, right? So that's, sorry. So that's why you can put it in the dependency array. Here we want the use effect to execute only once the component gets loaded. That's why we leave the empty array, I mean the dependency array as empty.
Yeah, clear to me, Somendra. Thank you.
Yeah. So that was a good question actually, because when I will discuss about brownfield projects, so in React, you will get two kinds of projects. One is a brownfield project and one is a greenfield project. That is because React has undergone a lot of updates. So earlier we used to use class-based components. Right now, what you're seeing, the syntax that you're seeing is for functional components. But earlier we used to use class-based components, like you have class use effect example, and there you did not used to have this use effect hook or use state or something, all those things. There used to have states defined in a very different way. So there used to have a method called component did mount. Okay. So a component did mount. Okay. There used to have component did unmount, and all those kinds of methods were there. Okay. So so this is a very common interview question, that how will you mimic the behavior of component did mount using use effect. So yeah, so this is like the answer. You just need to pass an empty dependency array, and that's how it's going to mimic it. Okay, I will talk about this class-based components later on, because it's part of the brownfield projects. I mean, the legacy projects that you have. For all the new projects, you just need to follow the one that we are doing right now. Okay, that's all for the user from the user effect section. What was it? Yeah, global state management. Yes. For that, let me open something. Mhm. Let's wait, open it. Okay. So, why the reason why I came to this part is because this is a project that I created for one of the interviews. So in the coding round, they asked this question. It was not meant to be done in one day. It was meant to be done in like 3 days. The time was 3 days. Okay, but what the reason why I came here is because um, I wanted to show you this part. Okay, so before I get into what is um, global state and why we require it, first let me introduce you to a problem that is something that's called prop drilling. So it's a design problem in React. Let me explain it to you using some simple diagrams. Let's say, oops, sorry. Let's say that this is one of your components, and this is another of your components, and this is another of your components. So 3 components. Now, what you want to do is like this component, and let's say this is 1, this is 2, this is 3. So this component wants to pass some data that needs to be rendered by this component. So how is it going to pass? So far, we have already learned that we can pass it through the props, right? So but the problem with props is that this has to pass the props to this, because this component is a child of this component, and this component is a child of this component. So you can think of this as the parent component, this is the child component, and this is the inner child component, because it's a child to this this child component. So if it has to pass the data, then the only component that this particular component knows is this one. So it has to pass the prop to this one. And then this will then pass the prop to this one. And if there's like in further inner components there, then the same process needs to be repeated when this has to be get passed to here. The only thing is that this parent component wanted only this child component to get the data. Okay. But since we are passing the data through props, we had to pass through all the intervening layers also, even though these components 2 and 3, they don't require the data at all, right? That is the problem of prop drilling. So one of the ways to solve prop drilling would be if we can create a store. Okay, we call it a store. So if we can create a store which will contain all the data that the components are using, then if this component has to pass the data to this component, what it can simply do is like store the data here and ask this component to pull the data from here, right? So in this way, it won't have to pass through this intervening layers and pass the data to this intervening layers unnecessarily. The parent component can directly communicate with the child component through this store. Okay, so this store is what we call global state. Okay, the use state hook, like the one that we were using, like even if you can find it here also. Yeah, this use state hook that we are using here, this is a local state because this state is only valid inside this component. Okay, this here we are talking about a global state. Now the global state thing also solves another problem. That problem is what we call I don't know what this problem is called, but I can explain you what this problem means. Okay, so let's remove all this. Okay, so you have, let's say, a component here, yeah, and some components here, and you have like another component here, here, and here, and you have a root component here. Yeah, so you have a root here. Now the problem is like this, let's say that this component wants to pass some data to this component. Okay, now the thing is like using props, you can pass the data down, but using props, you can also pass the data in the upward direction also. Yeah, I'll show you how it's done. Okay, but you can also do that. If you have a parent, then you can pass the data in the upward direction also instead of going downward. Okay, but what about this way? Okay, so one of the ways to do it is, for example, if this component needs to share some data with this component, then it has to first pass it to its parent, then this needs to pass to its parent, then this needs to pass to its root because root is its parent, and then this root will be able to send a prop to this component. Now this is a, what I can say, like totally like it's not a I'm not getting the correct word. It's basically a non-practical. It's not a practical way to do it, right? So this problem is also solved using the global state. If you have a global state where you have all the data, then what this component can do is like, it doesn't have to travel this way. All he has to do is to just save the data in the global state, and then this component can take the data from the global state. Okay. So these design problems can be solved using a global state, and you can understand why the global state is so important. So we will talk about global state later on when we will study Redux. Okay, there's something called Redux. Okay, I'll not cover that today. Mhm. Yeah, so that's something that I was talking about, that we will cover Redux later on when we will, but I can show you a little bit of Redux in our in the code that I wrote for that interview. So in here, if you see at the bottom, there's this constant map state to props, map dispatch to props. So what this does, Redux, is that it passes your global state as props to your component. Okay, so anyways, this is all like not required right now. We will cover it when we will do Redux. But one thing that I want to show you here is something about the reducer, okay, and how it works. So if you go here, you will find that there's a reducer defined somewhere on the code. Say in the pages, yeah, in the store folder, you will have actions, action time, and then you have this reducer. So this is what something that we need to see right now, because this will be used in your use reducer. Okay. So the first block that you see here, interface, this is not required right now. When you do TypeScript, at that point of time, it will be required. Okay, so this is how a reducer looks like. So a reducer is essentially takes your state and takes an action and does that action on your state, essentially manipulating your state. Okay. And based on that manipulation, based on the action that you have passed, your store, your global store gets updated. So if I can show you in a kind of a diagram, this part. Okay. So we remove all this. So the first thing is the event. This event is like you have an action, then you have something called a dispatcher. Okay. The dispatcher will then send it to the reducer, and the reducer will update the global state. Okay. So let me just name these things. Action creator. You can think of it like that. And this is your dispatcher. Okay. And this is your reducer. And this is your. Okay. So right now I'll write it as state, not as a global state, because I want you to focus first on how to manipulate the local state. Later on, we'll focus on how to manipulate the global state. Okay. Yeah. So the kind of, how it works is like you have this action creator, you pass it on, this action creator gets passed on to this dispatcher. This dispatcher executes this action by passing it on to the reducer. The reducer then takes this action and you can, pass it on to the state. Okay. So yeah, I'm not pass it on, sorry, update the state. Okay. So this diagram is like more important. Actually, in the local state, you don't use reducers that much, but I'll give you a use case where you might have to use it. Yeah. So we created our counter app. If you remember, in our previous sessions, we created our counter app. So in the counter app, we use this increment counter and we use decrement counter, right? And we were able to set the state here only. Okay. So in here, actually, you don't require reducer that much, but if you use reducer, your your logic will have much more clarity. You can very clearly define your logic. So I'll show you how to do that. So let's define the reducer. The first, so a reducer, actually, it takes, it gets returned, I think, it returns the state and it returns dispatch. Okay. And you need to use the use reducer hook. Use state, use effect, use reducer. Use reducer. So use reducer takes two arguments. Okay. The one is your reducer and the other one is your initial state. Okay. So first let's define these two things. One is like your initial state. So your initial state, you can define it like this. Your initial state, like a count can be 0. Count is 0. And now this defining the function reducer. Okay, so this reducer, remember that this reducer, that this use reducer hooks wants is a pure function. Okay, you know what is the difference between a pure function and an impure function. So a pure function means that it will always return it will always return the same data if the same kind of inputs are passed. Okay, so for example, let's say that if you make an API call inside a reducer, then that is not a pure function. Why? Because an API call can return multiple times or kinds of data depending upon what is there in the database, right? But a reducer will always return a pure function, always return the same kind of outputs for similar kinds of inputs. So this reducer function actually takes two arguments. One is your current state and one is your action. Okay, that is the action that you want to perform. Okay, now what we do is, okay, we will not do that. I mean, yeah, one thing is like it should always return something. Your reducer should always return something. So if like for the time being, if you if we are not writing the logic for the reducer, we can always return state, because that's the default thing that gets returned. Okay, if it doesn't match any case. So all we have to do now, like when we in here, I was calling the increment count. So I will not call this anymore. What I'm gonna do is I will call the dispatch function, and I will pass to it the type, which will be, let's say, increment, and the payload. Payload means whatever data you want to add. Okay, so right now, since we are just adding one or plus one on my, okay, I'll give you payload example later on. Okay, so right now all we have to do is like this is just a simple object which has a key type and a value increment. Okay, and this dispatch function is a special function that gets returned from the use reducer. If you remember the diagram that I was talking about, the dispatcher is very special here because it is the only one that can execute an action through the reducer. So, okay, so this dispatcher right now, dispatch function is just we are just calling the dispatch function with this type. Then here also we will do the same thing. We will call the dispatch function with type increment. Okay, now if we go to a reducer, we can write our logic. Okay, so what we are going to do is like we are going to switch over action dot type, right? So if the action dot type is increment, then state, then I mean current net temp equals to state dot count, temp equals to temp plus 1, and all we have to do is like set the state. So get state equals to count as temp. So if you are wondering what these three dots are here at the start, so this is like a very standard practice that we do wherein we actually destructure the state first and then set the count to 10. If you forgot about what is how to destructure an object and others, then you can find it in my first JavaScript session that I took, I think, with Sadhika. So there I explained about destructuring the state. Destructure simply means that it will take out all the keys from your object, and then we set the count to 10. Similarly, if we um, and then we have to return the state. Okay. And if the case is like decrement, sorry. Then we do the same thing. The only difference is will be this will be -1. Okay, since we have already used the temp here, actually we don't need to use temp here. We can copy it and keep it outside. Or maybe what we can do is we just change the name for this template something. This will also be yeah. And if none of this case matches, then obviously it's only going to return the state. So our reducer is now defined. So it knows like what needs to be done. And our initial state is also defined. So I think everything is good now. You can go ahead and run and see if this works. Okay, I think we haven't changed this. In the index.js, we need to put the counter. Not required. Where was the counter? Yeah. So if we click on increment the counter, okay, nothing happens. There seems to be some issue. Okay. The counter component temp deck is not defined. Okay. Okay, I forgot P there. There's this counter. Yeah. It will be P here. And since our state has changed a little bit, we are not going to use this state. Okay. Instead, we are going to use the different one that on this particular state. So instead of count, we should be rendering the state. So in the JSX, we change this. And this zoom thing is coming. Instead of this count, we should keep it as state. Save this, and there is another issue here. Objects are not valid as yet child. Object with, oh, okay, sorry. And it should be state.count. Yeah. You click on increment. Now if you click on decrement, so this works now. Okay, so yeah, as I said that, this reducer is primarily used for managing the global state, but you can also use it in your local state in case if you like, for example, if your logic for your state is like very complicated, then through this kind of an approach, you can, clearly define like for which case what is going to happen and stuff like that. Otherwise, what happens is like if you start, updating your state in an ad hoc basis through these kind of like functions and stuff, then it becomes very difficult to like manage like from where the state got updated, from which function got updated, and debugging takes a lot of time. So this is okay for if you are doing it for like simple components like this one. But if you have some complex component where you have complicated update logic to the state, then you should always use for reducer and use this kind of a, what you can think of it as a toy reducer, where you can actually write the logic for your reducer, and then you can, based on clearly define in which case what is going to happen. This is also very, what I can say, extensive. Let's say that when on increment, we don't want it to increment by 1. We want it to increment by some number, let's say 5 or 6, whatever. Okay. So we can also do that. Not here. We will not change it here. Okay, because then that's not very, correct way to do it. Instead of here, when we are passing the type, we just pass another value called payload. And in the payload, we pass the value by which we want it to increment or decrement by. So we pass 5 here also. And when we are doing this computation here, instead of 1, we use action.payload because that gets passed here. And here also, instead of -1, you use action.payload. Right. So if that is done, you come here, you refresh this, you click on increment, then it starts getting incremented by 5. You decrement, then it starts getting decremented by 5. Okay, so if you want to increment by any, now why I did it is because now you don't have to change your reducer. If you want to change anything, all you have to do is like whatever you are giving it as a payload, you can change it from here. Okay, so that's all from use reducer. You guys have any question? You can ask me now. We can move to the next section. Okay, so you guys don't have any question?
No, Samandra, for now, but I think we need to work on this.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, understood. So yeah, reducer at the start can be a little bit confusing, but yeah, if you start using it, you will get to understand it.
So
Yeah, look.
this line number 12, we are setting up the count value, right? So this count is the global value.
At line number 12, this one?
Yeah. So you are setting up the temp value inside the count, right?
Yeah,
So this count is like the global variable which we have defined on line number 4.
yes.
So how we
So
are
actually,
directly, yeah, tell me.
yeah, I understood your question. What you are trying to say is like how we are directly manipulating that count from here.
Yes.
So yeah, so that's because we are using this. So what we have done is we have destructured the state and then we have set the key count to temp. Okay. So actually we are manipulating this state, the global state only. Okay, the only difference is like we are not directly manipulating this state. We are creating a copy of this and then we are manipulating the count. So let's say why we do it is because let's say inside this here, we may have some other keys also. We don't want those keys to be affected. We only want the count to change. So we just create a copy of those keys and values, and that is okay in the state. And then we just set the count to temp. So yeah, so this is like more like it will be, let's say that instead of count, you may have some other data also here. Say name something, then you have count. So when we do this destructuring, what it does is it will it will create something like this. Okay, name something and then it will try to create this count also, but since we are again defining this count to temp, then this will be applied and this will not be taken from the previous section. So this is like more like a JavaScript thing. If you want a more simpler logic for this would be to do something like this. So let's say let state copy equals to state, and then inside the state copy dot count, we set the temp and then we state the state to be state copy. This 3 lines does the exact same thing as this 1 line. Just this is like little bit of JavaScriptish. This is like native. That's the only difference.
But
I
you are
think
saying that state that we are destructuring that object by putting 3 dots, and it is pointing to the initial state constant,
yes,
right? So
yes,
what will happen?
because
We will have like 2 constant there, 2 different constant. Then how it will understand, React will understand like this is we are destructuring that particular object.
Sorry, two different constants as in?
We have this initial state constant, right?
Yeah.
So if let's say we will have two here, two constant.
Oh,
Initial
you
state
want
two
to
also. Yeah.
Yeah, so initial state two. No, no. See, this is that's the so this is we only deal with one state here, not multiple states. Within the one state, you have to define whatever data that you have, and you have to manipulate it. That's the concept of the global state, right? That you have one large bucket in which
Okay.
you have all the data.
Got it. Clear to me. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, so we are done with reuse
So,
reducer.
Swamendra, one
Yeah.
question. So, you mean that what all things we define in that state, all the
Hmm.
fields by changing, by updating the state, all the fields in that state will be updated.
Mhm. Yes. Not all the fields. See, here you are creating the copy, right? So
Yes.
not all the fields, only whatever you explicitly define here. So in this
Suppose
case,
in the initial state, if I have defined 4 fields, and in the state equals to destructure state, instead with the count, I have defined only 2 here, not 4. Then
so in the count, instead of like you want something like this.
No. She is saying, Somendra, we will
Mm,
have 4 properties
mm,
inside the initial state object. Okay.
mm, mm,
And she's saying like instead of updating 4 property, we are going to update
mm,
only 2 properties. It means it will impact only 2 properties, not all 4s.
mm. Yeah, so all you have to do is like create a comma here, and whatever object you want to manipulate, you can pass it here. Let's say, for example, you have a P1, yeah, which is something, some property, then you have P2, which is some property, then you have count. Okay. Now along with count, I also want to set P1 to some value. So we can set P1 to say something that works.
okay, got now. Thanks,
Yeah.
ma'am.
Right. Okay. So use callback, use ref, and use memo. So these are a little bit of a kind of advanced topic. I don't have a very good example to give it to you right now, but I can tell you what it is used for. Okay, and we will use it when I get a very good use case. Actually, when you will do your project at that point of time, you'll get a lot of use cases. So these use memo and use callback are primarily used to improve the performance of your application whenever you are trying to when there is some kind of function that you are trying to that gets called every time, and you don't want it to call it every time, or like if you want to cache the value of something, then in those cases we use callback and use memo. First, let me give an example of use ref here, because that's a simple one. So what use ref does is like it creates a reference for you on the DOM that you can use. Okay. So for example, not here, I think we designed something where we had input tags, right? Yeah, here only. Yeah, instead of that, or maybe in the counter only we can do it. So let's say that you have an input tag. Okay. Remember that this useref can work on any HTML element, not just the input tag, but with input tag, I will be able to show you it in a better way. So so let's say that you have this input tag defined here. What I want is like whatever the user has inputted in this input, and let's say that there's a button on which clicking on which calls some function. Okay. Call function. And let's define this function here. So what I want is like whenever a user hits this button, then it should be able to see what the user has like given in the input box. Now, from our previous examples, we have already seen like for example in this not in this, I mean in the previous one example, I don't remember, where we have already seen like we can use it using the document.getElement by id, where we provide some id to the input, and then we use that id to fetch it from the I mean to fetch it and then use it. So you react, this is like a more of a JavaScript way, and so a more better way to do it is to use the useref hook. So you can come here and use the useref. So for using the useref hook, all you have to do first, you have to yeah, let's me use initial value mutable object. Okay, what it used to return? That I know. Useref, you can initially take it as okay. I forgot the return time. Let me just Google this one. Useref. So this is the React docs. You can directly refer here if you like. You don't need to remember everything. If you forgot what is the return type for a hook or what it does, then you can directly refer it here. Yeah, so it just returns a variable which is a reference to your component. So all you have to do is like in your input here, you have to just use this ref, and then you can use it to get your data. So let me show it here. So it doesn't return an array like in other cases, it just return input reference. And since initially it's not there, we will find it as null for the time being. And I'll tell you why I have defined it as null. Here I just pass the ref and I can give it some name. Let's say that I gave it something like input box or something. Yeah. So in here, if you see that input, okay, they have associated. Yeah, okay, that also works. If you, yeah, or otherwise you can directly pass it as a string also. Let's associate this input reference here. So in the ref, you can pass input reference. And so in our call function, what we want is to see. So we just console log the input reference dot we want to get the current value. So we get the value from this. Okay. So this does not do anything. So it just like console logs whatever the user has inputted on the input box. I mean entered in the input box. So so what we do is like we initially defined an input like a reference object where we use the useref hook. So this useref hook returns this reference object. We initially assign it to null, and then we associate this reference object to our input box by using the ref attribute. And then once this is like binded here, then all you have to like when we click on the hit, then you can use this input reference to get the current value and of it, or even you can use it to change the DOM. Like for example, you can bring the focus on this element like this, or some you can do stuff like that. Yeah. Let's first save it and see if it works. Where is our Chrome? Yes, you can close. This is also close. Yeah. Yeah, there seems to be some issue. Call function is not defined. Okay. This is our call function. Okay. Yeah. So let's say we open the browser first. Sorry, the DevTools. Here, let's say if I write hello, and if I click on hit me, then we get the hello here. Okay. So similarly, if I write, something, I click on hit me, and just return something here. So this is how it works. As I said that, so instead of like using this, let me just console log to you the input reference object itself, because at this point of time you may be wondering, how do I know that inside the input reference object there is a current key, and inside the current key there is a current key, and there is a value key. Inside the value it contains the data. So for that you can actually just console log this object. So yeah, so you can see that these are the things that are there within this object, and this has this current has this object called value, which contains the value, and there are some other things also. Many things actually are defined here. So from here you can see actually what all things you can do. Like for example, you can even associate an event like on, before, copy, on, blur, on, cancel. These are all events. If you remember, on click, just like on click an event, these are all events you can also associate with it. Or you can expand this also, like it's a huge object. Yeah. So all these things you can do. I mean, I'll just show you like one very simple thing. I think you may have focus here. Yeah. So instead of like the value, so what happens is like when we were writing something, so you can see this black border around the input box. That basically means that it's in focus. But when we click hit me or anywhere else, this focus gets away. So what I want is like as soon as you click on hit me, so the focus should return. So instead of value, if I write dot focus, then let's see if it comes to focus or not. I click hit me. Okay, it didn't come to focus. There was it on focus? I think on, blur, on, change, on, click, on, copy. Yeah, on focus. Okay. No, on focus is a function. On focus is not like on focus means that whenever it's focused at that point of time, what's gonna happen? Sorry. Yeah. Okay, the focus is actually a method actually. If we come here, just call this method. If you click on hit me, yeah, so it comes in focus as soon as you click on hit me. So right now it's not in focus. You click on hit me, it comes in focus. So that's what I wanted to show you. Like so this is the advantage. Actually, you can use the document.getElementById by ID also, and using that get element by ID, you can also associate events like dot focus and dot those things also from there. But if you are using React, then the what I can say, the standard way to do it is to use a reference, where you create a reference, because so this is actually more preferred over document.getElementById, is because I told you about the concept of virtual DOM and how React uses virtual DOM. So when you actually use the document.getElementById, it tries to fetch something from the DOM itself. right? But this reference, it basically creates an reference for that particular element using the virtual DOM. And that's why this use reference works faster in comparison to document.get element by ID. So if someone asks you a question, uh, what is the difference between why can't we use document.get element by ID, and why are we using reference when we can actually do the same thing with both, then you have to give this answer that if you because React uses virtual DOM, the input reference or whatever reference that we create using the useref hook is actually a reference from the virtual DOM, not from the real DOM. But if you use the document.get element by ID, it creates a reference from the real DOM. So and that's the reason like useref is a little bit, like not that much, but a little bit faster than document.get element by ID. Okay, that's all for the use ref hook. You guys have any question? Guys, are we good?
Yeah, Sominder, but I think we need to work on these three. So I think it's good we started today. We means after use state and use reducers, things are getting like a bit confusing.
Yeah. Okay. I'll stop for now. What we discuss, I'll just write it down so that you, yeah. So we discussed about we revisited we revisited the use reducer, sorry, use effect. We discussed about reuse reducer. We discussed about use
Right,
what
use
it-
state.
use ref, yeah. And there are two more things, which is use memo and use callback. This one I don't have a very good example right now. Okay, let me just see if the React docs have it. So these are like used for caching purposes, like if you want to. Okay, anyways, I'll discuss later on. Okay, so these two will be like very short. Okay. But yeah, so you can actually visit these three: use ref, use reducer, and use effect, and we will discuss tomorrow. Okay. Okay. And if you guys have any question from the last session that we had about use state, then you can ask that also.
The use state was good. I was able to work on it.
Mhm.
But yeah, on use ref reducer, I'll work on today. And if I have anything, I'll ask.
Okay.
So hello Sominder,
Yeah.
can you please give them assignment for today?
Yeah, their assignment essentially is to practice the use reducer. And oh yeah, I forgot to tell you one thing. Okay,
Yeah.
so all of you guys, we need to start working on our our POC, or you can, so you know POC, right? So a
Yes.
POC stands for proof of concept. So all we have to so once you get the concepts from React, you have to just prove that you have the concept. So yeah, so what we will be doing is like we are expected to create a e-commerce app. Okay. So in this e-commerce app, I'll share you the wireframes maybe later on, just giving you a heads up of what we need to do. You can start working on the UX part. The UX part, you can take any help of any library. Mhm. Yeah. For the UX section, you can actually take help of any library that you want. Um, but uh, but for the UI section, I mean, whatever we are discussing right now, that is something that we need to be taken into consideration. So, oops. Yeah, so what we want right now is just to get an idea. So once we just keep progressing on the stuffs that we are doing right now, Like for example, we'll keep learning about global state management and API calls and everything. Okay, and meanwhile, while we are working on that, you can start working on the UX design for your e-commerce app, like the basic elements, like the cards that are going to be used, the nav bar, and all those things. Yeah, we will be using all of that. So yeah, I'll share the wireframes later on. I was just giving you a heads up that we will be starting with the e-commerce app very soon, because we have now a very general understanding of like what needs what and how React works. And then yeah, your assignment for today would be to just revisit like whatever things that we have discussed today, like the use effect, use reducer, and other things. You can use this counter example also. If you have made it in the past, you can just use this counter example and write your reducer here, and based on that you can actually create your reducer and write your logic and update accordingly. Okay. So Rashmi, that's their assignment for today.
Yeah, okay, Sudarshan. So, Mendra.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so
Okay.
much. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.
So,
Yeah.
Amanda, I have some questions. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, sure. I'll stop sharing.